I have watched the night yield to the first flicker of invention. There was a time when cities were stitched together by the slow, smoky light of gas and the careful hands that tended it. Street by street, a new kind of brightness began to push back the dark, not with flame, but with a cold, electric arc that could be carried on wires, measured, bought. Into that tense air of possibility, a slender, restless man arrived, a man who would wire the modern world and then spend the rest of his life chasing a horizon he could not quite reach. He was born in a mountain village where thunder meant something more than weather, where his mother, who made mechanical devices in the guise of household tools, and his father, a priest with method and imagination, set the tone for a lifetime of paradox, faith in the practical and faith in the impossible. He learned to think in vectors and voltages, in visualizations so precise that an entire machine could exist for him long before metal touched metal. When he crossed the ocean to a city of steam and ambition, he came with little but a few letters of introduction and a relentless hunger to turn idea into light. His laboratories smelled of oil and ozone. Glass tubes hummed under fragile filaments. Coils spat blue sparks into the dark like slow flares. He worked not in fits and starts, but in long, deliberate sweeps. A mind that circled a problem until its contours were obvious. He saw electricity not as a commodity to be parceled by wires owned by corporations, but as a force that could be orchestrated, pooled, transmitted in waves, made to dance in patterns that would run factories, lift trains, and if he dared to dream, be tapped from the air itself. The invention that changed everything was at once elegant and almost inevitable: alternating current. Where direct current flowed steady and one-directional, limited by distance and loss, a system that alternated its direction in rhythm could be transformed, stepped up and down, sent long distances, and used with motors that were simpler and stronger. He imagined and built the machinery that made that idea practical. Induction motors that needed no commutator, systems of coils and transformers that spoke to one another in invisible waves. The math was cold and exact, the machines pure poetry in metal. But invention arrives into the world as commerce, and commerce has its own gravity. He found himself at odds with a different kind of current. The older guard, invested in direct current infrastructure, saw alternation as a threat. The conflict that followed was not purely of technology, but of narrative, of who would own the power that brightened cities. It took on the tones of a struggle between light and shadow, a campaign of fear about the dangers of the new, public contests staged with sensational demonstrations. Behind such spectacle, there were contracts, investors, and men whose names were larger than laboratories. He learned, with a kind of bitter clarity, that the seed of an idea is not the same as the right to make it reach everyone. Allies came. A businessman with a taste for bold engineering saw the value in the system and bought the rights to the patents, enough to push the new current past the noise of opposition. Together, they wired exhibitions and lit a world fair in a blaze of alternating light that looked like a promise. Then they went to a river where water could be converted into steady, cheap power and carried for miles. When the turbines began to sing at Niagara, the sound was not simply machinery coming to life. It was a signal that the map of energy had been redrawn. The cityscapes beyond that river would never be the same. Yet triumph was braided with compromise. Patents that seemed like victory also entangled him in agreements and obligations. The man who had carved pathways through copper and iron for the benefit of cities found himself negotiating with creditors and financiers, forced to choose between the slow logic of engineering and the sudden demands of economics. At times he stepped away from money to preserve a principle, and at times he returned, humbled, to keep projects alive. The machinery of progress, he discovered, ran as much on contracts as on current. He could not be contained by a single success. The coils he wound produced not only motors, but the spectacular high-frequency displays that became his trademark, glowing bulbs and streams of light that could outline the human body without a wire, that made vacuum tubes sing in fluorescent hues. He experimented with X-rays before the term had settled, and he toyed with techniques that would later look ahead to radar and radio. He built a boat that could be guided by remote control, a demonstration that made invisible commands visible. He patented more than a few dozen ways to move and measure and light, and he held a staggering number of patents across continents. In laboratories lit by blue corona and guarded by the smell of metal and hot oil, he behaved like a poet who had learned the grammar of machines. And still, one larger dream took most of his heart. If power could be sent on wires, he believed, why not through the ether? What if the planet itself could become a conductor, a single great station that connected devices across continents? He imagined towers reaching like the masts of giant ships, sending energy in controlled waves to ships at sea and to lanterns on distant shores. The idea was not merely utilitarian, it was ideological. He spoke of energy that could be universal, of light that would not be metered to the poor. In a world where electricity was becoming a tool of profit, he kept saying, through the language of experiments, that it could be used to lift humanity. The tower he began to build on a cape of sand was astonishing to the eye, a lattice of timber and steel rising toward the sky, crowned by a bulbous top that promised to be less a monument than an engine. He secured backing from a powerful banker who believed in the romance of science. For a while, the project hummed with life, but the banker wanted returns, not dreams. And as costs swelled and the practicalities of wireless transmission remained stubborn, the funding tightened and then vanished. The tower stood incomplete, a skeleton against the sky. Creditors closed in. The world turned toward different uses of power, toward systems that fit the ledger as much as the lab bench. Betrayal took many forms. Some of it was small, a promised sum that yielded only a handshake, a public slight, a patent disputed by rivals who could afford lawyers and influence. Some of it was institutional, patents bought not to free an idea, but to bind it within a market. The man who had given away a contract to ease a company's burden on the edge of bankruptcy later found his name in headlines that bore little resemblance to his intentions. He was simultaneously celebrated and marginalized, a public figure whose eccentricities were magnified, whose odd habits became the shorthand by which history would judge him. In the last decades of his life, the bright laboratories grew dim, the workroom lights inched lower, the nights grew longer and lonelier. He lived in hotels, moving from room to room, keeping meticulous notes and feeding pigeons in the cold parks of the city that never sleeps. He made claims that sounded like prophecy, and others that sounded like the ravings of a mind tired by ambition. Inventive bursts continued, but without the capital to realize them, they became sketches on paper, beautiful, incomplete, haunted plans. When he died in a small room in a great hotel, his ideas were collected and boxed by the authorities, the contents inventoried in the loose language of national security and practicality. The world, which he had helped to light, had little appetite for his more poetic pursuits. So how did a man who lit cities come to be called forgotten? It was not that his contributions were small. The motors that spin in factories, the alternating currents that run through our homes, the very notion that power could be scaled and transformed, these are part of his architecture. But history is rarely a ledger of pure merit. It is an economy of narrative shaped by those who can advertise, invest, and manufacture consent. The man who believed energy could be shared without tolls collided with an industrial age that depended on metering and ownership. Corporations that made fortunes selling power had an interest in a system where energy was traceable and billable. Scientific ideas that challenged that model found themselves either adapted into a profit framework or left as curiosities. His life contains a lesson that sits quietly and then becomes impossible to ignore. Progress is not just innovation plus discovery. It is also negotiation with the structures that distribute and regulate the benefits of those discoveries. Technology does not float free of politics. A wire is not only copper and insulation. It is a contract, a jurisdiction, a meter. He saw, perhaps more clearly than most, how the flow of power could shape the flow of lives. He also saw how often the flow of capital would choose stability over radical redistribution, fear over shared abundance. Today, in the hum of cities that glow with an alternating mind, his coils still sing. Engineers who wire data centers and plan smart grids stand on shoulders he built, sometimes unaware of the name that connects them. Renewables and debates about access return in different forms to the questions he asked: who gets light, who pays for it, and what does it mean to imagine power as a human right? Technologies he only sketched, wireless charging, global communications, have come to life in ways he could scarcely have imagined. Myth has braided with fact. Wild claims and authentic breakthroughs have made the truth of his life both richer and harder to parse. If the story ends in a demolished tower and a room piled with papers, it also begins anew in the way light reaches houses without wires, in how our devices sip energy in fields and across oceans. The arc of history has room for reinventions. The stubborn figure who once stood beneath blue sparks refused to accept the idea that energy must always be parceled out by ownership. He saw a different moral geography, where abundance could loosen the grip of scarcity and where ideas once freed could return to the service of people rather than profit. We live in a world he helped to imagine, and a world that also resisted him. To tend both facts is not to settle old grudges, but to learn from them. To remember that invention asks and demands of us how we will use it, who will benefit, and which voices will be heard when choices are made. The machines he designed carry our modern life. The failures in his story are an instruction about the social costs that can accompany technological advance. In the end, he was neither saint nor martyr. He was a brilliant, difficult man with limits and with gifts. He lit the world and then reached for a different kind of light, one that would not be banked or bought. That reach, though suppressed, is not lost. It lingers in laboratories and proposals and the impatient idealism of those who still insist that power might be a shared thing. The lamps he helped strike into life are still dying and being reborn in new forms. Among their steady beams, the question remains, as soft and insistent as a pulse: how much of our progress do we keep, and how much do we give away?